So, hello everybody. Jake and I thought we would come together to have a little chat about the Feldlager project that we've roped ourselves into, and what it is and why we do this. And of course, it's just the two of us now, because Nick couldn't make it, because of course our third partner in crime in the organization is Nick Kraus. And I suppose what it comes down to is that we found a set of partners in ourselves in wanting to really work on this MILSIM medieval version, this live action wargaming, this whatever you want to call it. And I think the main thing that we said to each other is, if you read historical accounts of battles, now then they tell you about this battle that happened. There's all these units and where they started and where they came from, what their political affiliations were, and all that kind of stuff. And then they attack, and then they hit each other, and then somebody wins, and they kind of go, but what happens when they actually merge? When the merge happens, what then? And people are remarkably unclear about this. And we come from a HEMA background, a reenactment background, living history background, historical background, all of those things together. And you kind of go, well, we're used to looking at sources and what they say. And why don't we apply similar, at least as far as possible, similar methodology and an attitude to the more macro combat, historical combat recreation, rather than the micro historical combat recreation that ended up being HEMA. I think that is the main point. Did I word that right?
Yeah, I do. I think that's right. I think when I look at my own background and coming out of the military and as I got into historical European martial arts, and as I began dabbling in armor, and as armor led me into more of the reenactment community, I began thinking about things I really wanted to see and to do. And there's lots of us out here for different reasons that want to do some of these things, right? We want to experience a little bit more of that military side of what we're doing. We want to experience units working together as units. And that means units working in an environment where there are leaders, where there are formations, where there are things that we know that they did intentionally. And I don't think there's been as much focus on trying to do what they did the way that they did it as we have in some other areas of both reenactment and of historical European martial arts. And so we just thought it'd be a really cool idea. And certainly we're not the first to attempt this, but a really cool idea to bring some of these things together, to bring some of the things that we know from the modern military and how it functions, frog DNA, so to speak, into the mix here, bringing in some of that ethos in historical European martial arts of let's look at the sources and try to create the sources and interpret the sources. And then the material culture of reenactment, which is so far ahead in terms of what does the equipment look like and what are some of the cultural aspects that influence this. So it's a really cool blend of things that interest us. But really what we're trying to do is get at this thing that we feel like we haven't had a chance to get deep enough into through any of those other areas individually.
I think it's a really good point. I mean, just like the HEMA community kind of came out of what came before. And of course, it was a subset of people that, to a large degree, already had experience in what used to just fall under reenactment. And it's not as if reenactment hadn't tried to get combat right. I mean, they had done so for decades. It's just that they became sort of almost from a study group that within that, it merged it into a separate activity. And similarly here, it's not as if people haven't tried to really get battles in a realistic sense and try to figure this out. Absolutely. But I think we have a few resources at our disposal that are a little bit more a step ahead from what we had before, and things like that. And for instance, I suppose the obvious thing that I would like to mention is the cavalry. We've got 44 cavalry lined up at the moment. I hope they're all going to make it. It's expensive for all these people to join in. And 44 cavalry is, of course, a big number. It's not as if there has never been a reenactment show with bigger numbers. I think of Hastings 2006. They had 100. However, this is not a show. This is not a predetermined show. This is free, and this is also a fairly large landscape. So the playing field is a very historical size and shape. And that allows us a lot of things and a lot of difficulties. It allows us difficulties that you might have circumnavigated if you have to do a show. And that allows us to play with those things, which also means that the people that, for instance, are on the horses, they can't just be any old person on any old horse. We have comparatively high level of tack on the horses. We have a comparatively high level of training on all the horses. It's averages, but the average is fairly high. And then, of course, there's all the historical equipment. We have a relatively large amount of equipment in general. We have relatively many people in armor and stuff like that. We even have multiple horse armors. And so we are starting to have resources that just weren't around, as far as I'm aware, 20 years ago.
Well, and I think we see this reflected on the infantry side as well, right? We're looking at well over 100 infantry on the field, not to mention all the other people and camp followers and other folks that are going to be involved in this. We got a ton of infantry on the field comparatively. We're going to be able to put some pretty significant size groups out there. We're bringing in, I think, a relatively high concentration of crossbows, which is something else. Again, never as many as I want. I would kill to have like 100 crossbows out there, right? But we're going to have about 24 crossbows out there on the field, and we're going to be able to use some of these historical formations and some of these historical battlefield techniques out of the books, because we're going to have just enough crossbows for the size of infantry that we have, for the size of cavalry that we're facing. Just try some of these mixes and engagement scenarios that I think historically have been very difficult to pull off unless you're doing it for a show. And if you're doing it for a show, you're in a limited field. You got to make it a show. It starts at noon, it lasts 2 hours, and then it's over. We're doing something extremely different. We're going to live a very militaristic life for about 48 hours. We're going to get up early. We're going to go to bed late. We're going to be active that entire time. People are going to be tired. We're not going to have an agreed meeting point for battle, right? We're going to have 2 units that have to make their way through the terrain and try to find the best location to pitch battle and to bring the enemy into that area without accidentally giving away too much of their own position or giving away too much of the advantage of terrain. So the warfare that we're hoping to see in 3 weeks from now is as much about maneuver and position and reconnaissance and scouting as it is about 2 groups lining up on a football pitch and charging at each other.
Yeah, and one of these things that, of course, becomes far more apparent the moment you start doing that at that sort of an unknown quantities is, for instance, communication. Obviously, communication is going to be a really massive problem because no radios, everybody makes lots of noise, and you can have a predetermined plan, and then obviously you know it's going to fail. So what are you going to do to corral people in the right direction? And when you have a predetermined plan where you can put commanders in the actual spot on the field that's designated, then you can kind of just pre-choreograph this. But the moment you don't even know on which angle on the same field you might be engaging, that already puts a spanner in the works. So just how many trumpet calls can you remember?
Right.
Can you even notice that they were played? That is going to make life very, very different only by that coping. So all these extra little bits of this would work great if you can pull it off, but this other thing is easier to pull off. So maybe even though it's inferior, it might be superior because it's actually going to happen.
Well, and I think, I think when you look at, you think back to the conversations you and I had a year ago and how grandiose we were thinking and really have continued to think very grandiosely about trumpets and drums and banners and flags and runners and all of these things that we want to have happen. And, if we had 50 great ideas a year ago and we settled, 6 months ago on 20 of them, we're probably successfully incorporating 10 of them. And like 6 are going to go pretty well. And the other 4 are going to be like, well, better next year. Part of what's so exciting about Feldlager this year is that it's the beginning of what we hope to be a many, many years transformation of creating a certain kind of event and continuing to evolve the event to bring more realism, more accurate techniques, more accurate communication techniques, more accurate maneuvering techniques, as we learn from this event, we get to bring that into the next one. And maybe 10 years from now, we're doing the stuff that we were giddily talking about, 10 months ago, right?
And this segues into perhaps a question that some of the audience might think of. Of course, 2 years ago, we already did one in the same place, and it was about half the size, which was really good because it was during Corona, and there was a quick lull in the numbers, and we were suddenly allowed, and we had 4 weeks to organize it. So me and Nick and some friends of ours, me and Nick organized it, and got an international group together of about 120 people and 16 riders or something. So we already did one, and then we spoke to a bunch of people to kind of go like, so, well, that was all very fine and good for something we threw together in 4 weeks. What we would like to see more of, and there were a lot of suggestions, but for all intents and purposes, they're going to be vague because people are trying to say something quickly, and it's actually really complicated. So they were really trying to be helpful. And what then is, I think, so interesting about this cooperation with yourself, Jake, is that you came in with this military organization of an exercise background. And that is starting to put organizational underpinnings to allow a lot of these things that people wanted, but were vague. How do we get 200 people to do a vague thing without telling them what to do? That is a really difficult concept, even though everybody kind of sort of wanted that. Yeah. And then this military training event sort of idea really is, I think, a bit of a game changer as far as an organizer is concerned. That we can actually make another step and then go on from there and have more ambitions in that direction, and go from, oh well, we gathered and had some fun, to, well, let's take this a bit further. So for instance, somebody might have noticed the cards that we're having. That might sound like utterly gamey thing to do, but obviously that was fully out of military training.
Yeah, the conversation. I mean, I remember we were talking about this and looking at some of the tech, if you will, that gets used in LARPs, for example, and a lot of these other activities. In the U.S. military, at least, which is my background, when you're running an exercise, a big war game, and I'm talking about a full month where you're out in the desert in California, or you're in the swamp in Louisiana. It's in between your rotations, your deployments to Iraq, and you've got to spend a whole month to train all the new guys that didn't go with you last time and get everybody ready. And so you go out there with your real equipment, with your real weapons, except with little modifiers on it, so there's no real bullets. But you go out there and you do all of that. But I remember the way that casualties are handled is you get this little casualty card. You get a tiny little card in an envelope, like in the board game Clue, if you ever played that. And you put that in your pocket, and you go out and you have your adventure. And when something happens, something explodes, or you get shot, or whatever, the referees look at you and they say, pull out your casualty card. And you pull out the card and you open it and you read it, and it says, your leg is injured, your arm is injured, you're dead, lay on the ground and scream. And then the medics have to run over and practice being medics, and all of these things happen. It's such a funny, gamey kind of thing, but it leads to an actually more realistic training. And one of the things this allows us to do, these casualty cards, is try to get the way that casualties happen on the battlefield to be more in line with what we've seen historically in the old numbers, right? If you think about, there's a handful of battles where everybody died, very small number of battles where everybody died, and they're famous because of how weird it was that everybody died, right? Cannae in Roman times, for example, right? But most battles are over when you got 10% to 25% casualties on the ground, and 25% is considered a slaughter. And so we wanted to use the cards not just to randomize the way that casualties happen a little bit, but more than that, to get the percentages of people that flee in terror, the people that retreat conservatively, the number of people who drop dead on the spot, and the number of people who lay there wounded and need to be saved by their friends. So that's programmed in. Add that to the 2 steps back rule, right? The sort of 2 meters back rule every time you get hit. This is going to make engagements of force on force much longer. You're going to actually see one unit pushing another unit across the battlefield. A commander is going to be able to look and see that the left flank is starting to turn, and will have time to send reinforcements, instead of the traditional LARP reenactment and HEMA having it for laughs mass combat, where 30 people charge 30 people. 30 seconds later, there's 2 people left alive, which is just not how this is supposed to work. We can't possibly test historical techniques if we're not at least attempting to model historical wound and casualty percentages. And so the cards let us do that in a way that's like a game, but also very much pulled from real military training techniques.
And I just thought they were fun, actually. We tried them out when we had a training session just last week. It actually was quite a fun thing to do. And again, all of these things, the last 20 years, we've had several discussions with various people, try to do these things like that. But now it's a bit more structural. And now I think we're prepared to actually implement it. And I think we balance it fairly well. One of these other discussions is the endless issue of some people in real life, you would poke with a weapon once and they would just drop immediately in shock and just be, for all intents and purposes, out. And other people, you hit a million times and they just keep going, where you kind of go, your head is off and you still keep hitting me. And and everything in between. And this, again, with the cards, allows you this sort of randomness, because also, even in my limited experience myself, I've had instances in my life where from one day to the next, my ability to take injury was completely different from one day to the next. So even you know, I'm a hard guy. There's no such thing. It's just completely random what happens to you, which is why we randomized it. And that also means that you can't rely on certain techniques with your fencing. Oh, I hit him and I covered the afterblow, so I'm done. No, it's not good enough. There's more to it, and you need to keep all these eventualities in mind. And again, this is a very interesting sort of thing, I think. And it's a model, it's a game, yes, obviously, and it's a way of dealing with it. And I'm sure it will develop, and I'm sure it will evolve. And we are trying to figure stuff out. And like I did a lecture ages ago, it's important to read the sources, then try stuff out. So you reconfigure your questions to the original sources, and then you go back to the sources and go, hang on, I found an example. Hang on, I found 15 examples. Hang on, I keep not finding an example of that other thing that I thought I would have immediately assumed was being said. Then all of a sudden you read the sources again. So to do proper history, you need to kind of make it yours a little bit.
Yeah, you got to experiment it. If there were like a couple things I really wanted to come out of this whole event, right? It's that we go and we attempt this, and then later when we're reading the sources, we're like, oh, wait a minute. This thing happened at Feldlager and it helps me understand this. And now next time I go to Feldlager, I'll do it better because now I understand this text that I didn't have enough context for, you know, until I did this. So that's probably one of my biggest hopes for this whole thing, is that we'll all have some of these light bulbs, some of these revelations where we see things in text that we maybe know really well and have been studying for a long time, but we see things newly, you know, because of the experience that we have. And then we get excited to do this again, and we create a little bit of a subculture between the HEMA communities and the reenactment communities and the LARPer communities and the MILSIM communities, where we have this cool little nexus that becomes a gathering point for all of us that have similar overlapping, but not quite the same hobbies. And this becomes a genuine meeting place where we can bring those things together, where we can bring these communities that have more in common than sometimes we like to admit together. And we can all gain a lot from each other's particular approach to this thing that we all love. That if we accomplish that, this will be an enormous victory, and I think everyone's going to have an incredible time. I think we're going to have an experience that certainly isn't something nobody's ever tried before, but I think we have just a couple of things in place that are going to make it probably different from what anybody who attends this time will have ever done before.
Yes, there's a few people that have been to the major ones that spring to mind before that are kind of heavily involved in this. Like, for instance, the Bexbach events are probably a famous one. The previous Feldlager, we're building on that. The other thing is, of course, we're going to have a camp, and people are going to do their camp things in the camp. And there's nothing wrong with that. We're not disparaging that in any way, but of course our focus lies with the actual military exercise outside. And we are actually doing a whole bunch of things, like, I don't know, writing orders in actual medieval script with actual feather pens and and all the that's quite a lot of logistical nightmare, just because you can't just pick up your biro and write an order. It's another issue in itself. So we're looking at it from that practical point of view, that military point of view. However, we have lots of little civilian things, and just people doing their thing that they like, and they happen to do it at our event. These are technically sideshows. However, they are kind of interesting and important sideshows, and people
and they add to the atmosphere, they add to the environment, and these sideshows, if you want to call them that, existed during the real thing as well. So they add to the authenticity.
Yeah, so and that's another, I think, thing that I would really like, is for people to develop their own little projects that can be just bolted on to our big project, and that they can use the platform to do their own experimentation or their own exploration, if it's not an experimentation per se. For instance, there's a group that's doing a household of a nobleman, and they are doing, to some degree, their thing in the middle of it all, and that is really cool, that people can have their own little projects and kind of use the occasion for that kind of a thing, and people who have ideas for the future, we are wanting to develop this further as it grows, from how do we get to the battle, can we do a long-term march, from all that kind of logistical side of things. Now we might be bringing in straw in round bales with a truck beforehand. Should we try and do that by hand with the medieval carts? Oh, that's again, stuff that we can't do yet, but they might be interesting in future. And I think it's kind of funny to kind of dream a little bit and ask these questions and play around with it. I mean, I've been trying to play around with, how do you stable all these horses for some time, and now we have a version that is also allowed by current veterinary rules, and kind of gives some sort of an idea of what we're talking about, even though it's slightly different. And there is lots of logistics. I mean, it might be interesting to those of you who are not into horses to see the pile of poo at the end. That's a thing. That's something you have to consider. That's something that will affect the landscape when we leave, and thereby, of course, we have to remove it. And it's stuff like that. There's so much logistics in this, and I think we're also trying to record it, to have some sort of ability to assess it afterwards. So I know I'm going to have months of fun looking at exactly what happened, and how this one guy tripped over that molehill, and then that whole unit was too slow, and thereby that other unit got trampled, and then I'm going to be chewing that up for months on end.
I think one of the biggest opportunities that we really want to capitalize on here is collecting as much data as we can, and sometimes that's videos, and sometimes that's stories, and sometimes that's conversations we have afterwards. But it's also going to be looking at debriefing each of the units when they come back in from their patrols and from their missions, finding out how many times each casualty card was activated, roughly how many deaths were represented in a given action, right? How long did it take when half of a unit routed to recollect that unit calmly and bring everybody back together? One of the roles that I had really, really huge aspirations for, and I still think we're going to get to do a lot of it, I just won't get to do all the preparation I was hoping for, was the various leaders, right? We've got Rotmeisters, we've got, front line leaders, we have, of course, the captains of the infantry and the cavalry and the overall army. And a real military organization very strongly functions on its leaders and its leaders' ability to make certain decisions, to understand their troops, to use their troops effectively, and to communicate between each other. And as a former military officer, I think that's the part of this that is maybe most exciting to me, is how are we going to do that, and how do we begin creating a subculture, not just for the units that already have it, because some groups do already have it, right? We've got a couple of groups that already function as military companies in the reenactment world. I know one of the American groups that's coming, trains specifically sort of as a rot, and all they do is work on noise discipline and how quickly can they get armored, and can they get into certain formations in a certain amount of time, and so on. I want to take each of these features, have these leaders learn from each other. I want to learn from them. I want to spend time with those commanders and kind of play, play soldier for a weekend. I think it's a really, really cool idea. I think it's a really, really cool opportunity. And I hope that those people who've already been selected and the ones who are yet going to be selected as frontline line leaders and Rotmeisters are really give their all to it, because so much of the success of the whole event is going to depend on the individual unit leaders.
Yeah, and it's of course also just a matter of fun. Is just work together, as opposed to just stand in the line and try to poke more people than someone else. I mean, that's fun for a while, but after 10 years of that, usually it gets a bit boring. And I think, especially also with the dichotomy in the speed of the cavalry, the terrain is challenging, but doable. It's going to be also a physical challenge to people. You know, getting up that hill in armor. Yeah, I at least have a hill outside my house, so I can just practice every once in a while, which I do. And it's like my major cardiovascular workout is put armor on and walk up the hill and back down. And it's this kind of stuff is what do gradients do? What is the distinction between the speed of the cavalry and the infantry? What about a gradient? What does that do?
Mm-hmm.
And this is gonna, because the distances are just a little bit bigger, you're gonna see very, very different speeds of maneuver.
Yeah.
And I think that's gonna make it very interesting.
So I think, you know, what's the last thing that we kind of want to close with, Arne? What do we want to kind of tell the people that are coming and the people that are thinking about coming next time? What's the last thing we want to capture for them and to get them excited about the vision here, and so that those that do come, you know, here in 3 weeks, show up ready to participate in this dream?
Yeah, I think it's one of these things that, you know, in the reenactment community, we talk about authenticity a lot. And of course, authenticity usually gets translated in historical accuracy. And obviously, that is a very big part of what we do. And we want that too. However, this authenticity has a lot to do also with what is historically accurate for this one thing you're doing or representing. If you're living a castle, Burgbelegung, we say in German, then you are inside a building and you're doing something civilian, a day-to-day civilian. That is one context. Now, this is the military context very specifically. So we are trying to be authentic to that. So, for instance, if you're representing a knight, like I'm doing, so yes, I have a horse, I have armor, I have lots and lots of very expensive toys. But we actually see from the sources that I should probably empty my tent mostly. I probably won't have a lot, and I should be sleeping on the floor, and things like that. So I have all that gear for events, and I might not bring it. And it's one of these things is, let's look at authenticity together as a group, and let's look at authenticity, the authentic understanding, the authentic experience, the authentic picture of what is going on, in order to really build on our understanding and to also formulate where we want to go with this. Not just Jake and I and Nick, and but if you guys have plans and dreams and ambitions, come and talk to us. God knows, we might be able to do it, and frankly fund it. I mean, we're all hemorrhaging literally tens of thousands of euros in this. Literally.
Don't remind me.
Yeah, but we like to do that, and if we can potentially facilitate those who cannot bring up such funds to join us and enjoy this, and hopefully kind of build up the reenactment community in that sense.
Brilliant.
So,
well, 3 weeks to the day, I'm going to roll in and I'll see you. And I think everybody else will be rolling in 2 days later. Those of you that are coming, we cannot wait to see you. We have been preparing for this for a long time. Like Arne said, we've dumped our children's college educations into it. So we hope you come and have a really amazing experience. It's our greatest hope for this whole thing. And we hope to see a whole bunch of you here in 3 weeks. Thanks.